Hey folks, Sylvia's here. I'm on FDR or FRV since they wouldn't let me put his whole name in. It's been a while since I did a video with him. To be honest, the last video I did with him I ended up not putting up because I forgot about it. Whoops. Alright, so I'm here in the Femur Hills. Gonna hunt some goblins, but while I'm doing that, I'm going to kind of talk about the recent... How do I want to word this? Sorry, I should probably come up with a script before I do these every now and then, but it's tough. I don't want to say the recent. Let's go with just the. Well, I'm going to talk about voter ID laws. Essentially, is what I'm planning on speaking about here. So for those who don't know, this is a American thing. It's relevant because this is an election year. And voting obviously has effects with election years, but it doesn't have anything specifically to do with the election year. I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or anything like that. We're just going to talk about voter ID laws. So what I'm going to do here is, and this is a completely different format than my last two FDR videos, so keep in mind it's kind of a work in progress. But anyway. So what I'm going to start with is I'm just going to start with simple facts, okay? I will comment if I decide to state my opinion early, but for this first part it's all going to be just simple facts. So yeah, there we go. So before I get into that though, I think I should probably answer the question of what exactly am I talking about when I say voter ID laws. Well, okay, so in America, in the past, you basically just needed to register to vote and then kind of show up with pretty much anything that kind of proved your identity. A social security card would work. I think you could also use a bill. It differs state to state. I honestly can't remember what I had to use when I voted. I only voted once, by the way. Yeah, I cannot remember what exactly it was that I used when I voted. But yeah, it's not terribly of a difficult process. Most people are registered to vote already. I know school actually had me register to vote through a in-school thing, it's your civic duty, blah 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 blah. So I voted. I registered that way. Incidentally, because I thought it was funny, I registered as a communist, which was actually a hassle to correct and deal with in the future. So yeah, don't do that if you can. But anyway, so yeah, that's how I registered through school. So yeah, you show up at your polling station. Basically, the way it works is you have a specific polling station that you need to go to. You can't go to another polling station. So if I'm in, northern Pennsylvania, where normally I live in southeastern Pennsylvania, yeah, southeastern, I would not be able to vote up there. I would need to come back to southeastern Pennsylvania, or I could get an absentee ballot or something along those lines, or I could do early voting is my other option. So yeah, that's kind of how it works. In the past, you would just show up. You'd have your social security card or something along those lines. You did not need photo ID. What's this say? Oh, good. I did it. So yeah, it's a pretty simple process, I suppose. Anyway, I want to say it was. Hold on, I'm actually gonna pause and look this fact up. Okay, I'm back. So yeah, it was. Whoops! What did I just push? What am I pushing now? What? There we go. I couldn't figure out how to close the interface. Anyway, so in 2013, there was a Supreme Court case that went in America. It was Shelby versus Holder. I don't know exactly who Shelby. I think Shelby was a county in one of the states, and Holder was the Attorney General of the United States at the time. Anyway, so this case went to Supreme Court, and ultimately the Supreme Court ruled, I guess, in the favor of Shelby. And it removed a section of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act was put into place, I want to say in the 60s. I'm not 100% certain, and it doesn't really matter. for purposes of my commentary right now, so we're just gonna skip that. Anyway, so yeah, it was Shelby versus Holder, and it overturned a part of the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act has a whole bunch of stuff inside of it, because, you know, it's not just like one ruling, it's several, you know, for the sake of being confusing. Anyway, so one of the provisions, so to say, was that states that had a history of doing unfair things, essentially, with allowing people to vote. Like, in the past, there were things called, like, poll taxes you had to pay to be able to vote. And, you know, ultimately this was determined to be, like, unconstitutional because you have a, like, you know, a legal right to vote regardless of whether or not you're poor. Likewise, there used to be, like, literacy tests, which, again, like, I can almost see the thought process behind that. In fact, I mean, I can see the thought process for that, because, I mean, like, obviously you would not want people who are, like, catastrophically stupid to be voting. Obviously, that's not what the literary tests were actually designed for. They were mostly designed to prevent, in this case, well, minorities, but in this specific case, black people, from voting. Most black people at that time went to segregated schools, if they went to school at all, and their schooling was generally not terribly great. So these requirements were to keep them from voting, so that, you know, to keep them powerless, essentially. Anyway, so in the past of America, there was a whole bunch of shenanigans and things like that went down. So the Voting Rights Act basically stated that if a state that has a history of those types of issues wants to make any kind of change to how voting in its state takes place. Now, whether or not that means moving polling stations, changing hours, or things like that, or whether or not that means, you know, like requiring certain things, like a photo ID, for instance, would be an example. If the state wants to make any change to how people in their state vote, and that state or a county, so it could just be like, it might not be all of Pennsylvania, it just might specifically be Delaware County, Pennsylvania, for instance. If they want to make a change, they have to get federal government approval first. So what they basically have to do is they have to go to the federal government and be like, look, this is the change I want to make. I want to require everybody to have photo ID to vote. And the federal government has to look at that and then go, well, here's the pros and cons, blah, 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 blah. Maybe the federal government will decide in favor. Maybe the federal government will decide against it. Who knows? Anyway, it was determined that this part of this part of the Voting Rights Act was, I guess, not okay. So where did he go? I lost him. There he is. So in Shelby versus Holder, it was like overturned, and that piece was removed. So immediately after, we had many states, and before that, we also had a lot of states doing it too. But those states were states that didn't have that particular problem. But we started seeing a whole bunch of states. Now, most of these states that had issues were in the South, because, you know, racism. Anyway, so following that, we had a whole bunch of states that suddenly showed up, and they started passing voter ID laws, amongst other things. I'm gonna kind of limit this video to just voter ID laws. I might do a follow-up on the other things, but let's just stick to voter ID for now. So, it was following the removal of the Voting Rights Act, essentially, that we started seeing a lot more of these voter ID laws. All right, everybody follow me so far? That's a fact, okay? All right. So, now, that is our first fact. Now, our second fact is who is coming up with these ideas. Now, passing of laws in the United States is a strange and weird process, and I'm not going to get terribly involved in it. It's worth mentioning, though, that most congressmen, senators, or state legislators and governors and whatnot do not they themselves write bills. In theory, it would be their staff that writes a bill. So, like, if I'm the governor of Pennsylvania, and I've got a staff, and I say, look, I want to come up with a law that, I don't know, makes playing Tibia mandatory for children, okay? That's my goal. So in theory, my staff would like sit down and write that bill, and they would come up with like all the legal terms, and they would try to fill in all the blanks. And I do not want to be down here. Let's go back up. They would fill in all the blanks. They would, you know, try to address any issues, like what do we do for people that don't have computers? Do we waive their need, or do they have to go to a public computer place, or do we use you know, whatever. This is the thing. In reality, though, what usually happens is you kind of subcontract that out to what's usually called like a think tank. So a think tank is like a group of usually like-minded people. You have Republican think tanks, you have Democrat think tanks, you have communist think tanks, you have socialist think tanks, you have, you know, you have all these different think tanks. And some of them are specialized in certain things. So some of them might be a like Republican conservative think tank specializing in education and like childcare. You might have a liberal leaning one that specializes in foreign relations, specifically involving like military affairs and things like that. Anyway, that's where you usually get your bills from. So what we have going on with the I feel like I'm gonna sneeze coming. What we had going on with the laws being passed, or proposed, I should say, for voter ID laws, were that they were all being written by like the same two think tanks. So mostly it was an issue of the think tanks went to the like state governments and were like, hey, here's an idea for a bill, you should kind of pass it. That's like an oversimplification, massively, but that's the general idea of what happens. That's annoying. I feel like I leveled up. So yeah, that's kind of how things work. So the thing though is that these like bills essentially are kind of coming from the like literally the same group of people. Anyway, and then they're all being handed off to state governors and state legislators. The ones that are then proposing these are all Republicans. Nice, got a wolf's paw and a bear paw right in a row. Pretty much exclusively Republicans all around. And they're only really being like forwarded and successfully implemented in states that have both like Republican control of the legislative branch and also a Republican governor. So what we're seeing is that it requires a full Republican hold on the state government for these types of bills to be passed. If there is a Democratic governor, he vetoes the bill after the legislative passes it. If it's a Democratic legislative branch, the bill doesn't even appear in the first place, no matter how much the governor would want it to be. So that's the situation we have. Okay, so these are bills being promoted solely by Republicans. Gotcha. So that is a fact. Okay. Now our next fact is that what are these bills designed to do? And when I say what are these bills designed to do, I'm referring to what they say the bill is designed to do. I'm not going to, at this point in my video, I'm not going to talk about what some kind of unattended or hidden agendas might be. I'm going to just say that, like, when they come up with the bill, they're like, this is the problem that this bill is supposed to address. Okay? So the problem that these bills are supposed to address is voter fraud. Now, specifically, we're talking about a specific type of voter fraud, which we would call in-person voter fraud, which means you go to the polls in person and you commit fraud. There are many different types of fraud you could commit, but in this case, we're talking about this specific type. Can I go down here? Oh, I can go down here. That's kind of cool. So yeah, that's the specific type of voter fraud. Now, when you're kind of talking about voter fraud, though, the other big one is, so basically, well, hold on, let me break back up a second. By the way, guys, you're missing it all, but I'm making all these wild hand motions and everything. I'm like conducting an orchestra right now. It's easy because the goblins aren't really like a threat to me. But anyway, so yeah, we've got. So the idea, let's talk about the idea behind the laws. So the idea is that there is a fear that when I go to the polls to vote, I am in some way voting more than once. In theory, that's the main idea, I guess. There is another like minor subset, and we'll talk about that too, actually. But the idea is that I go and I vote as Silvius, and then I also use the ID of like Franklin Roosevelt, who also happens to be registered to vote at that polling spot. Because again, you can't vote at another polling spot. So yeah, there. Now this could come from me somehow, like, you know, voting for my family who's not intending to vote. And then the other thing that kind of happens sometimes is the more benign, like, my grandmother wants to vote, but she can't. Well, I mean, my grandmother would be a bad example because I really can't pull off being a female too well. Or, you know, like being 90, but whatever. Let's say my grandfather wanted to vote, but he couldn't get out to vote, so I go and I vote in his place or something like that. And I guess the other one that happens too, and it still is a little bit more benign, but still I guess a little bit sketchy, would be somebody who is ineligible to vote, but wants to vote anyway, and then they use the name of somebody who's eligible to vote, but who isn't planning on voting. So in this situation, it's usually an ex-con, because if you're a convict, you're not allowed to vote usually, or at least there's various rules that kind of limit it. So that's what you usually see in those situations. That said, having a photo ID would not address the ex-con situation, but anyway. So the idea is that these laws are there to prevent you from voting while somebody else. So like I would have to go in and be like, oh yes, I'm Silvius's grandpop, Franklin Roosevelt, and they would go like, okay, I need to see your ID, and then I would present an ID that says Franklin Roosevelt, you know, age 86, and they would look at me and they go, this doesn't look like you at all, and you're not 86, and then I would, you know, not be allowed to vote. Or I would show my Silvius ID and go, hi, I'm Silvius, I'm here to vote, and I would show them my Silvius ID, and they would be like, okay, that's you. We're off to go. We're good. And at face value, this doesn't seem like entirely unreasonable. I mean, you do have to use like an ID to buy cigarettes or get alcohol or, you know, do a lot of things. So, I mean, it doesn't seem entirely unreasonable at face value, and I do get that. So, anyway, though, that's the thing that these laws are designed to prevent, which is in-person voter ID. The problem is that in-person voter fraud is like shockingly rare. I forgot to mention it too, which is going to kill me a little bit inside. But what kind of gave me the idea for this video in the first place was that I watched a series on Al Jazeera about this topic. And I kind of wanted to just throw my say into it. And they'll be linked in the description if anybody's so inclined. But anyway. So the Al Jazeera video said that your odds of... when comparing your odds, the odds of you having your ID, or not your ID, but having somebody else impersonate you to vote are less likely than the odds of you getting struck by lightning. Which I think is, I think that says something. I'm actually going to see if I can kill the hunters. And or die. I feel like dying is a good option. Oh yeah, because they have way more HP than I thought they did. Yeah, this is a bad idea. This is quite a bad idea. Well then. But yeah, so you're in reality the odds that type of in-person voter ID fraud happening at the polls is just incredibly rare. We're talking like 24 instances in a year and things like that, like incredibly low numbers. Now, I mean, like, yeah, 24 numbers is bad and not great, but we are still talking about incredibly low numbers, and that's what this law is designed to, combat. Now, there is a more common type of voter ID fraud, and that usually is using absentee votes, which is like, basically, you vote with a piece of paper, and it gets mailed in. There was, in fact, in Pennsylvania, an incident where a group used absentee ballots from people, and the candidate himself, his assistants and like workers, filled out the ballots for people and then mailed them in on his behalf, kind of situation. But that also happens incredibly rarely. Like incredibly rarely. It is more common than the in-person one, because the in-person one is like, the in-person one is the equivalent of like walking down the road and finding $1,000 just sitting on the road. The absentee ballot one is like the equivalent of walking down the road and finding like $500 or something like that. It's more common, but it's still incredibly uncommon. It's the kind of situation we're having. However, requiring an ID when you go to the polling station will not do anything to stop a person from impersonating you with an absentee ballot or an early voting ballot. So the voter ID laws will do nothing to stop the slightly more common but still absurdly uncommon type of fraud. So, just to review, we have 3 facts so far. The first fact is the description of what voter ID laws are. Our second fact is that these are promoted and put forth only by Republicans. And our third fact is that the benefit, or the intended benefit, or the proclaimed benefit, the benefit that they say that is there, is to stop something that's incredibly uncommon. And then it also does not address the slightly more common type of fraud you might possibly encounter. Okay, so those are our facts. Now let's hit a fourth fact at this point. Now our fourth fact is what exactly happens when you require people to have photo IDs. And what happens is that it makes it harder for people to vote, because you do now have to go through an additional step. Now some people might say, well, really, how difficult is it to get a photo ID? So I'm going to use myself as an example right now. For instance, I do not have a valid photo ID at the moment. My photo ID did, in fact, expire last year in the summer. They sent me a form to renew it, but at the time I had my learner's permit, and I was planning on like learning how to drive a car and getting a driver's license instead of a photo ID, because there is a difference. So since I was planning on doing that, I didn't bother going through the steps of renewing it, because I believe you have to pay money to renew it. And that seemed sort of like a hassle at the time, and I figured, well, I'll be getting my driver's license before then, so it'll be fine. Ultimately, I never got my driver's license, because driving lessons cost a bunch of money. So my license expired. Or not my license, my photo ID. I never had a license. So that does, in fact, mean that if I wanted to buy a pack of cigarettes, I would not be able to. If I wanted to buy a case of beer or a bottle of vodka or whatever, I would not be able to, because I do not have valid ID. So specifically, I am a person who, if voting, well, I mean, like, I don't know actually what Pennsylvania's standing is on voter ID laws at the moment. But when I go to vote in the primary, which I think is on the 18th of this month, I will be unable to, because I don't have an ID, if there's an active voter ID law. And if the election comes around and I still haven't corrected that problem, I will not be able to vote. Now, before that, though, as I said, which you may have concluded based off of the fact that I said I had one and that it expired, I did in fact used to have an ID. And I'd also like to kind of talk real quick about what I went through to get my ID. So the photo IDs are issued at the DMV, which stands for Department of Motor Vehicles. It is a most wonderful place where everybody is happy and smiling, and all of that is lies. If you've never had the misfortune of going into an American DMV, you don't know what you're missing. The DMV is full of people who have had their souls crushed by mind-numbing bureaucracy and dealing with awful people every day. So they're kind of sandwiched between like rules that they have to follow and then people who can't do basic tasks at all. So most of the people that work in the DMV are probably on like suicide watch lists, would be my guess. And like, to be fair, I do kind of understand where they're coming from. I'm not trying to be like too mean to the DMV people, even though I had particularly bad experiences at the DMV myself. But anyway, so if you have not had to go into the DMV, you should do it at some point, because it's a learning experience. But anyway, so I go into the DMV. I look online. I knew I needed 2 proofs of residency, my social security number, and my birth certificate to get a photo ID. I also needed $35 via check or money order. Oh, and throwing that out there too. If you don't have a checking account, you need to use a money order. And money orders, when you buy them, like at a store, they have a fee that's usually $1. So that actually increases the cost to $36. Not that that's huge, but it's there. All right. So I get my proofs of residency. I get my social card. I get my birth certificate, and I go. Except at the time, I had a hard time finding my birth certificate and my social card. Ultimately, okay, I find them. So I go in, I wait in line. It's all awkward. I get up there. I'm like, I'm here for a photo ID. The guy's like, birth certificate, social security card, proofs of residency. I hand over the envelope that I have these things in. He looks at my birth certificate. He goes, oh, this is a copy. I go, what? He goes, this is a copy. It's not the original. I'm like, really? So I look at it. I don't know. It's like, looks like a birth certificate. It's not like black and white. It's not obviously like, something that was printed out in a photocopier. He goes, no, I mean, this is like a high quality copy, but you can tell like there's a seal on it and the seal has to be raised, and this is not a raised seal. I'm like, oh, I did not know that. And then he like looks at the social security card and he goes, oh, that's also a photocopy. And I'm like, really? Okay. So apparently, for whatever reason, I guess when I was getting a job, my mom had made copies of my 2 documents. So that way, I guess the originals would not be lost, and I guess copies are sufficient for applying to a supermarket. They are not sufficient for the DMV, which the guy repeated to me over and over and over again, while like laughing at me and calling his coworkers over so that they could look at the quality of my documents. It was a unpleasant experience. But yeah, regardless, so I had to like leave. So now just keep in mind that like this took like an hour, because the DMV is filled with wonderfully long lines and people that don't know how to read and can't do anything, and it just in general is a terrible process. So yeah, no dice for me. So I have to, I waste several hours going to the DMV essentially, and because I don't drive, this would have meant I either like took a bus or took a cab and paid for that, or in my case, I bothered a family member and made them take me. Which is, whatever. Still though, like, it bothered 2 separate people in this situation. So then I had to go get a social security card and I had to get a birth certificate. Well, okay, so birth certificates are kind of a hassle to get, but they're not that hard. In Pennsylvania, I go online, I go to this website, they ask me my parents' names, and then they charge me $30, I think it was, to get a copy of my birth certificate. So first off, this process, because again, this is relevant, I think, to where the discussion's going. So to get my birth certificate, I needed to pay $30, and then I had to tell them the name of my mom and father. In my specific case, I have not seen my father in many years. This is not a fact that bothers me. However, I did not know how to spell his name. In fact, I didn't even really know what his last name was. And the website was so kind to mention to me that if I entered the information wrong and they could not like discover my birth certificate, that they would like send me an email and be like, yeah, we couldn't find your thing, try again. However, it could take them 4 weeks to find out that they didn't have my stuff. Oh, and it would take them 4 to 8 weeks to process my order and ship the thing out, and then I was looking at like another 2 to 4 weeks for shipping time. So we're looking anywhere between like 2.5 to 3 months. I'm sorry, 1.5 to 3 months for me to get my stuff. And then when I go to do it, I realized that the website pre-selected fast shipping and tacked on an extra $39 to the bill, making this $69. Ultimately, I, was not paying an extra $39 for expedited shipping because expedited shipping was still taking it 3 months, potentially. So when I went back to normal shipping, my time frame went up to 2 to 4 months instead of 1.5 to 3. So just keep that in mind, that if you need an ID or you need a birth certificate to get an ID, and there's a time frame to get that ID, like let's say you're trying to do this in, late September so that you can vote in early November, you might not make it in time. Luckily, I did get the name correctly, and I got all the numbers and whatnot correct. So it did arrive. It arrived about in the middle, about 2 months. No, about like 2.5 to 3 months, I guess. I guess on the lower end, but yeah, still. So, yeah, I got that, and then I figure I go to the Social Security office and I go to get my Social Security number, and I run into the awesomeness of a catch-22, where the Social Security people tell me that they can't give me my Social Security card because I need photo ID proving who I am. I say to them, well, I don't have photo ID because I don't have a Social Security card, and the Social Security card, or I'm sorry, the DMV wouldn't give me a photo ID without a Social Security card. And they say, well, we can't give you a Social Security card without photo ID. So, they tell me here's what they can do. They can give me a temporary request form where I'll go to the DMV, or no, what they'll do is they'll give me a temporary Social Security card that's like a piece of paper signed by those people. I take it to the DMV. The DMV guy needs to sign off on it, and then that will process as my my Social Security card, and then I'll go back to the Social Security office, and then I have to turn the ID in then. The problem with all this is that the Social Security office closes at like 3 p.m. and that it was, I went in at like 1, and, I spent an hour waiting in line at the Social Security office, so it's currently 2, and, I still have to go back to the DMV. So that was another day shot. So then I start up early on the next day, off to the Social Security office, get the temporary form after waiting in line for an hour, to the DMV where I wait in line for an hour, use the temporary form to get the photo ID, which takes an hour in addition to the hour I waited, essentially. And then back to the Social Security office where I got to wait another hour. And, so like all in all, this process took like 5 to 6 hours. And then ended up costing me something like $65 approximately. So that's my experience of getting this. So that when you say how difficult is it to get a photo ID, well, in my case it cost $36 and also took it required a wait of 3 months, and then also required me wasting 3 days of my life, in essence. Also, while this was not a problem for me, but when I spoke about those proofs of residency are bills that come in your name to your address. It has to have your address on it. I do not know if printed out statements count. So if you have, like wireless billing or something like that, you might not be able to print out your statement and it might not count. More importantly, though, a lot of people live with family or live, with roommates and stuff like that, and the bills tend to be in one person's name. So, if you're, rooming with your buddy, or, I don't know, somebody you met on Craigslist who isn't murdering and killing you, the bills might be in that person's name. So you might only have maybe, your cell phone bill, and then no other bills being sent in your name or something like that. And if you're currently unemployed, you're not getting, a pay stub or a W-2 form or anything like that either. So that could be a hiccup there, too. Anyway, so that's just kind of face value of it, of how difficult it could be to get a photo ID, and it could be that difficult. And then in addition, we've got the money issue and other things. So the question now is, and this is going to kind of lead into a fact, is who are the people that are most likely to not have photo IDs in the first place and will be required to get one? The people that are most likely to not have photo IDs in the first place are poor people, minorities, and students. Most, middle-aged people, have driver's licenses. And if they don't, they've been to somewhere where they require an ID at some point, and they have an identification form. Whether or not that's a passport or a military ID or a photo ID or a driver's license, most middle-aged people have that. Most middle-class or wealthy people also have them. And, generally speaking, most white people have them too. It is the Latinos and the, Southeast Asians and the black folks who tend to, not have them because they don't have their own cars and they don't have a real need for photo ID. It's also students who don't have them, which is kind of my situation where, as a young person, generally speaking, just as a young person. Not so much a student, but young people tend to not have them. And then it's, again, poor people who, like, again, there tends to be a lot of overlap between these things, where a lot of young students also tend to be poor, and a bunch of minorities also tend to be poor. If you also look in minorities, you have a lot of, like, actual, like, Japanese, South Koreans, and, you know, those kinds, who tend to be a little bit wealthier than your, like, Latinos and whatnot, and they tend to have photo IDs. So anyway, though, the people that end up tending to not have those IDs are those three groups: young, poor, minorities. Those are the ones that tend to not have ID. And while this isn't necessarily a fact, it's more of a inference, but we can kind of infer that if you are poor or young, not only are you most likely to not have an ID in the first place, it's also going to be more difficult for you to get an ID because of, you know, time constraints and money constraints. But anyway, that's just an inference and not an actual fact. Anyway. Now, what an actual fact is, though, is that by requiring photo ID laws in states that have already, like, done this and then had voting periods, it was discovered that people of those groups are, in fact, less likely to end up voting because you have added a hurdle. Now, we can debate about how high that hurdle is, but a hurdle has been put in front of the, like, goal line of voting. And some people are going to just not be able to make that hurdle. So people do, in fact, don't vote because of these laws. And it is not potentially fraudulent votes that are, if anybody says that, they're just wrong. They're making crap up. Like, legitimate people who should have been able to vote end up not voting because of these laws. That is a fact. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that demographic-wise, these three groups, how do they tend to vote? Well, young people tend to be more liberal than older people, especially on social issues. Economic issues are sort of complicated, but young people tend to be like, yeah, gay marriage is fine, abortion's fine, you know, everybody should be happy, nobody should be sad, kind of situations. That's an oversimplification, and it might be an insulting one, but so be it. So they tend to vote Democrat. Like legalization of pot, things like that. Minorities, black people, Latinos, they tend to also vote Democrat. Poor people, again, tend to vote Democrat because, you know, the Democrats generally are more on the, like, welfare side of things, you know, like let's support some people when they're having a rough time in their lives kind of situation. So what we have here is now let's just go over the facts real quick. We have these laws are presented by Republicans. These laws are stated to prevent a type of fraud that is incredibly uncommon. These laws have a side effect of making it more difficult for certain people to vote. These people that end up being having it made more difficult for them to vote tend to be poor, minorities, or young. Poor, minorities, and the young tend to vote Democrat instead of Republican. Those are all facts. All right, like we can argue any number of points beyond those facts, but those are all facts. Like they're not arguable topics. They're just the way it is. So those are the facts we're working with. In other words, a side effect of these laws makes it very difficult for a group of people to vote. That group of people tends to vote Democrat. And these laws are being presented or passed by Republicans. Now, you can look into that as much as you want, and you might, see some things. But those are the facts we have to deal with, okay? I don't think anybody's, really got an argument. Now, some people will dispute my numbers of fraud. But let me... There's a term we need to speak about, and it's called, bias, okay? And bias means that your opinion or your thoughts on a topic are clouded. So generally you want what it's called an objective view on things. is Tibia a good game? Like, let's, we can objectively discuss the pros and cons of making Tibia your MMO of choice. A biased person would be a developer that makes Tibia. Like, you wouldn't really trust him to give you an objective, fair opinion on, is Tibia a good game? Now, you would expect him to know a lot of details about Tibia. He is an expert on the field of Tibia, but he's biased. He's not an objective person. So if I come to you and I say, hey, so I'm thinking about playing Tibia, should I do it? And then your only source of information is that guy who's a developer for Tibia, the information you give me is tainted, essentially, and I can't rely on it because it came from a tainted source. In other words, so when I say there's like no instances of actual fraud, and then people pull up like some factoids where there was instances of fraud, if you're getting them from like Republican-leaning think tanks or like Fox News, your source is biased, okay? And most likely, wrong or stretching the facts. I hate to tell you that, but that's what's happening. Some of the more extreme examples given were, like, one of them took place in 1968 or something like that, where that was one of the the largest series of voter frauds or something like that. So we can like discuss how common this is, and we can like look at different facts, and a lot of this is like you extrapolate it from data points. It's not like everybody who commits voter fraud signs a form afterwards being like, by the way, I just committed voter fraud. We can debate that, but make sure your numbers aren't coming from the Republican for Life super PAC or Donald Trump's campaign or something along those lines. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, likewise, you shouldn't take your facts from Hillary Clinton's campaign or something like that either, but, So, but yeah, like, that is a topic that could be discussed. And you could also kind of discuss, like, well, it doesn't matter how many people have it made harder to vote, as long as one potentially... I should not be fighting a hunter right now. As long as one potentially illegal vote is stopped, it's worth it. Yeah, I'm going to not hunt that. That's kind of that's a topic that can be debated. And if you hold an opinion like that, because that is an opinion and not a fact, there's really not a lot I can do to change your mind if you refuse to change your mind. But like, it is a topic that can be discussed. Some people will say that like voting should be hard so that it like weeds out the unfit, which is something I think somebody specifically tweeted in that Al Jazeera video I was talking about. That's a topic again for debate. I don't think that's a valid opinion. Well, no. See, that's not true. I think that's an irrelevant opinion. Because I could see some value into that. And I've actually kind of like tossed some ideas around when me and my friends are talking things randomly. The fact, though, is that the Constitution and like the rules that we have do not require a competency test, and there is no requirement for you to like... I mean, and while this might not be a good thing, there is actually no requirement that you have any idea, that you know anything about what you're talking about when you vote. Like, there's no requirement for you to just be like, look, I'm voting because... I'm voting for Donald Trump because I just really think the last name Trump sounds cool. Like, that's just a really solid name. Like, Hillary Clinton... Hillary, that's a terrible name. I can't vote for somebody named Hillary, but Donald, that's just a good name. Like, okay, currently you can vote based off of that. In fact, actually, last election cycle, one of my friends voted for Barack Obama because the Mayan apocalypse was supposed to be approaching, and he thought Barack Obama sounded more ethnic than Mitt Romney, and that made him think that Barack Obama was more able to fend off the Mayan apocalypse. And so he voted for Barack Obama. So, like, that guy's an idiot. And perhaps some form of competence test would be nice to have. That said, though, I mean, like, that guy was also middle class, like, middle upper class, and, you know, had a driver's license because his parents bought him a car when he turned 18. And he would have been able to vote regardless. You know, and people will say about how, like, you know, there being one fraudulent vote, even if there is only one fraudulent vote, it invalidates somebody else's vote. Well, that guy, my friend, his vote definitely invalidated somebody's vote. Somebody voted for Mitt Romney after, you know, thinking about the issues, you know, carefully considering things, and their vote was canceled out by him being a moron. Like, on so many levels, him being a moron. That person's vote was invalidated. So, like, I don't really think that's a particularly valid argument. At least in the terms of this. So, I mean, that's kind of the situation we have with the voter ID laws right now, where they are negatively impacting Democrats, and, you know, they're being presented by Republicans. Now, at the same time, the Republicans are having a really rough demographic issue at the moment, where the demographics of the country are changing. The middle-class, middle-aged white dude is no longer the most populous group in our country. And the things that, you know, individual groups want are possibly different. You know, those middle-aged white folks kind of want their Social Security so that they can retire when they hit 62. Those, like, you know, in crushing poverty people, or those students who have, like, you know, no real, like, life aspects because they're burdened with massive student loan debt, they have different needs. Social Security is going to be bankrupt by the time I go to collect it. So, like, a politician who's telling me he's going to, you know, increase Social Security payments just means it's going to bankrupt sooner, and I'm still not going to see it. So that politician does absolutely squat diddly for me. A politician that says, I'm going to make college more affordable for you, that does something for me. That does a lot for me. You know, and, you know, like a politician that says, like, I'm going to expand, like, food stamps or Medicare, Medicaid, other forms of welfare, that does something for some people. But yeah, so, you know, I mean, like, it is what it is in that sense, but I don't even know. So we have these issues, though. And it's an issue for the Republicans because the demographics are changing, and, you know, more of those old folks are, you know, dying, and a new generation is coming in, and the new generation is also predominantly, significantly more diverse. More minorities, more black people, more Latinos, more Asians, more Indians, more Arabics, more people. And they're largely, by and far, voting Democrat. So with each passing election cycle, the Republicans, just on a pure, like, number situation, more young people are reaching the age where they're allowed to vote and are voting Democrat. And more immigrants are coming into this country. By the way, illegal immigrants can't vote. Just throwing that out there. But more immigrants are coming into this country and are voting Democrat. And more people are finding themselves in crushing poverty and are, you know, voting. Whereas, on the other hand, most people that are middle class and aren't in crushing poverty right now are sort of falling into that as the middle class is kind of disappearing in the country. And also, a lot of those white folks are kind of dying due to old age. So just based off of, like, a pure, you know, age going by, not even discussing, like, whether or not topics or their opinions are right or anything like that, the Republicans are just losing based off of the demographic switch. So it seems almost as if they might have some kind of unspoken rule where they're trying to limit the number of Democrats that could vote. Now, that's what it kind of looks like to me. If you ask me, that's what I see. What I see is Republicans that take control of an area. You know, they take control of the state. Like, let's say Kansas. They got a lockdown on the governorship of Kansas, and they got a lockdown on the House in Kansas. And they pass these restrictive voter ID laws they tell people, oh yeah, it's to prevent voter fraud. And then they also, they kind of like throw it out there with like, well, it'll prevent illegal immigrants from voting too. Because if there's one thing like, Republicans sort of hate, it's illegal immigrants. So they kind of like tie that in there, and then they kind of go, okay, so yeah, we're going to prevent all them illegal immigrants that are stealing your jobs from stealing your vote too. So we're going to pass these voter ID laws. And, the people buy that up. Because, again, and like on face value, as I mentioned, like it doesn't seem that difficult to get a photo ID. And it does seem sort of reasonable to require a photo ID too, and I do get that. But then you have people who can't get their photo IDs and who struggle to like meet that requirement and then don't vote. And those people tend to be, again, Democrats. So the Republicans kind of say this. They make it harder for Democrats to vote, and then Democrats don't vote. And then, here we are. So they're able to like fend off the their like losing demographic battle, essentially. Now, and that's what it just looks like to me. Now, I could be wrong. And I sure am positive that a whole bunch of Republicans will tell me I'm wrong. And they're going to go, no, this is about the like sanctity of our voting process where there can't be any fraud and blah, 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 and your numbers are all out there. But, the facts I gave you were facts. They're not really open for debate. The only things that are open for debate are, like, numbers and what really constitutes... Like, what constitutes a worthwhile goal and what constitutes an acceptable loss. Like... If it was only going to disenfranchise one voter and prevent one person from not voting, but still stop 24 cases of fraud, I would say, yeah, go ahead. That's worth it. But if we're only stopping 24 cases of fraud, 28 cases of fraud, something under 100 cases of fraud each election cycle, and we're disenfranchising like thousands of people, because that's what the numbers are looking like. We're preventing maybe like 100 to 200 cases of fraud, maximum, an election cycle. And we're disenfranchising possibly tens of thousands of people, if not more, who are going to ultimately not be able to vote. Because, in the DMV, hours are bad and stuff like that. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, I think. There's a lot of other things that are going on to disenfranchise voters. But this was just specifically voter ID issues. So anyway, folks, that was my take on voter ID laws. I tried to stick it to the facts as much as possible, and then I kind of threw my opinion out there at the end. Feel free to disagree violently and verbally inside of my comments. Give me all the death threats you want or anything like that. And anyway, folks, like, favorite, comment, subscribe. Check me on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook. I'll see you folks later once I remember how to close my program. There we go.